This is a radio broadcast addressed from the League of Nations on the global war effort against the Morgana threat, where we report the recent happenings amongst the major nations contributing to the defense of our united front. I am your speaker, Ammaraglio Maus, but you may refer to me as Commissar, or simply the Speaker, whichever you or your government prefers. October has ended and spooky season is over, with November coming to take its place. However, like time, the Morgana threat never stops moving forwards towards their ultimate goal of humanity's destruction. And with this first week, we here at the League bring you an extended broadcast as some nations of the world are pulling double duty in order to stay on top of all of the events happening around them. First up, news from the League of Nations. Things improved quite drastically for the League recently, and even more so following the actions and successes of the captain of the international fleet. Before the Battle of the Skagerrak Strait was even complete, the officer who ultimately won it all, the one who's coming to be known across the world in a kind of journalistic shorthand as the Captain, took to the radio and wrote to every major newspaper that could be reached, exhorting humanity to come stand united behind the League of Nations at the start of the Zurich Conference. Their argument was that only a coordinated international response could protect human life, and that the League of Nations was the only organization that existed that could provide a supranational umbrella under which such a force could organize. The captain stated, quote, "There was no time to waste. There were no national interests that mattered more right now than defeating the Morgana threat." The public took notice of this statement, along with the reports of a joint Kriegsmarine Royal Navy operation to save Oslo in northern Denmark at the climax of the Battle of the Skagerrak. As a result, support for the League rocketed upward, and it seemed like a time of incredible possibilities. Of course, for the actual members of the League of Nations, and for the diplomats and bureaucrats who ran the day-to-day operations, it was also a time of total chaos. Nothing in their careers had prepared them for this. The League Charter certainly didn't anticipate it either, and only months before the entire organization had seemed like a spent force. "Hooray for the captain," an anonymous League staffer reportedly said, "but damned if I know how we're going to do it. Hopefully they can find a solution while the iron's still hot. Otherwise, the dream of the United Front might crumble under its own political weight." And of final note, on October 31st, the Zurich Conference formally opened at the Palace of Nations, where delegates of the League will finally reconvene to discuss current events. The decision on how to move forward will all be decided in the proceedings ahead. Following that uplifting report from the League comes news from the Axis, more specifically from its leading member, Germany. At the end of the week, Adolf Hitler addressed the Reichstag with an alarming yet direct message to Mussolini, one that he particularly did not want to hear. Hitler stated, quote, "The destiny of Southeast Europe will be settled by Germany and the Soviet Union. Mussolini's Greater Balkan Neutrality Pact would not be a welcome development in neither Berlin nor Moscow." End quote. What this could possibly mean for Italo-German relations is currently unknown, but it is safe to say that if Mussolini and Italy as a whole continue on this path, it is likely that they will not find much favor in the eyes of the Reich in the future. After that comes news from the Comintern, whose members subsequently enacted the War Plan Intelligence Gambit, PC Bruno, with a 78% support amongst the member states. Chateau de Vignoles was under scrutiny as a place of high interest to the French government, and thus the Comintern. Reports state that an attempt was made by communist agents to cultivate a seemingly sympathetic staff in order to arrange for continued access. Unfortunately for the Comintern, they failed. Two of the people of interest were not responsive. One indicated they would go to the authorities if approached again, and their best bet ended up tripping over a bicycle as he tried to run away from the guards after he immediately raised suspicion. It's rumored that the Deuxième Bureau has him chained up under cheap boulangerie somewhere in Seine-et-Marne-Coulée, but there's no evidence of this currently. What is evident, however, is that this event set the network back a step, as well as reaffirmed France's stance on anti-communist policies. Following the updates from the world's factions, we direct our attention over to Italy, who, even into the start of November, remains as the world's leading nation in combating the Morgana threat. This week, foreign diplomats looked at Italy's choices and found them consistent with three fairly solid hypotheses. Mussolini wanted the Dalmatian coast, he wanted a friendly buffer between Italy and Germany, and that he was resentful of Germany's own efforts in the Balkans. Depending on who you ask, any one of these could be the likely reason. But with worsening relations with Germany and the growing war exhaustion in Italy, it's likely that any progress towards this goal would be hard to achieve. Regardless, the ships of the Regia Marina, who were badly worn from months of relentless fighting, received new orders and were sent to prowl in the Adriatic Sea following the enactment of War Plan Yugoslavia Campaign Intelligentsia, which found 79% support from captains. Their mission in the Adriatic was to scout out the ships and defenses of the Royal Yugoslav Navy, and, of course, any Morgana that might complicate future proceedings. It was also expected that Prince Paul of Yugoslavia would recognize the threat for what it was. Of course, at the same time, rumor has it Italy was preparing to offer him and his neighbors a diplomatic overture. The Italian government had resolved upon the creation, if it could be accomplished, of a greater Balkan neutrality pact. Ideally, the pact would consist of Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, Greece, and Hungary, and that they would all come together in an alliance strong enough to deter the Nazis from looking south from the Süddeutschland and the captured Polish territories, as well as the Soviets beyond the borders of Romania at Bessarabia. Hopefully, such an endeavor will succeed in the end. Meanwhile, as the Morgana mist receded from Italian shores, people suddenly stopped talking wistfully about the glories of Vanity's Palace of Glass. The strange mood that had gripped them passed almost as quickly as it came. Perhaps this is a sign that Vanity is on the move and preparing some sort of counterattack against the Italian people. But the people of Italy themselves have little time for speculation. Winter was coming, and it was likely going to be a hard year. Following that, we leave the Mediterranean and head towards the United Kingdom, who, through much effort, has become the second leading member contributing to the defense of our united front, surpassing Japan and the French in a single week. Quite a strong showing for the start of the month. Let's see if the boys can keep it up. This week, and arguably the biggest development for the United Kingdom, was the triumphant Battle of the Iceland Sea, an outcome as surprising to the 12th Cruiser Squadron as it was to the Morgana. Earlier this week, British scouts in the region discovered a significant group of cargo ships adrift and unoccupied. The Admiralty quickly resolved that they wouldn't try to salvage the cargoes for themselves, with one admiral aptly stating, quote, "God only knew what had been done to them," end quote. It presented a unique opportunity, however, and so the British Admiralty proposed the war plan, the Ghost Convoy Bait the Trap, which found 80% support amongst the Houses of Parliament and was subsequently enacted by the Prime Minister on the 29th of October. Later on the 30th, the AMC HMS Dunatar Castle was sent out seemingly alone, but shadowed closely by the Royal Navy's 6 destroyers and 12th cruisers a bit further away. What should have been an irresistible bait turned out to be a trap set by the Morgana themselves. At roughly 1720 local time on October 31st, sunset on Halloween, a large fleet of corruptions came tearing out of the southwest and directly into the 12th. The British were outnumbered more than 2-1, but the cruisers, although taken by surprise at the outset, soon began to take a toll on the enemy through superior gunnery and night training. They were able to form a rough line and held long enough for the 6th to join them. Even HMS Dunatar Castle was able to join the battle, albeit at the very end. When the shooting was done, it was as clean a victory as anyone could have wanted. Within days, Churchill was receiving telegrams of gratitude from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with an excerpt of one of those letters stating, quote, "A lull in fighting along the northeastern seaboard might generally have been the result of the battle off Iceland's northern coast," end quote. In other news, the Royal Navy had one other action of some significance. It conducted an investigation of its own into the sinking of HMS Royal Oak, temporarily barring the scientists and researchers of Pembroke VII from accessing the wreck. Amid conclusive evidence of German involvement, vital remnants vestiges of Royal Oak were recovered as a result. Pembroke VII spearheaded the investigation of possible artillery fire from Hoy, but soon came to the conclusion that no gunfire came from those islands. Reports of fire that direction were put down to the afterimage of muzzle flash in the eyes of the lookouts. The corner of British intelligence dedicated to understanding the Morgana threat was not happy about being excluded from HMS Royal Oak in the critical days following her sinking, but they soon patched things over. They subsequently purchased a set of wrecks from Ernest Cox and set up a research station on top of them. Finally, of last note, the strange mood of discontent that had gripped the British Isles seemed to recede this week. The sour thoughts and bitter words of the previous week were soon forgotten by friends and family, almost as soon as it had began. No one knows what brought about this sudden change, but I'm sure that the United Kingdom is thankful for this nonetheless. Following that, we hop across the pond and towards the United States, who has found themselves the third contributing nation to the war against the Morgana, surpassing Japan but just falling shy of the initiative set by the United Kingdom. Regardless, it's still good to see nations continuing to become more active in the face of the Morgana threat. This week was arguably the hardest week of fighting the U.S. had yet endured in the Morgana War, in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. The abnormal storms that had been festering off the coast of Puerto Rico was of great concern to the United States, especially so since the storm seemed to be challenging them. But they couldn't forget their obligations to the Philippines either. After a short debate, members from the Senate and the House of Representatives voted upon and passed the War Plan, the Trench, Locate, and Capture, and subsequently the War Plan Pacific Vanguard, the Relief of Manila, which found 85% support. Early in the morning on October 28th, American forces in the Caribbean steamed into the storms that had battered the western Puerto Rican coast, eager to challenge the Morgana fleet known to be gathering there. The American screen immediately proved their value by uncovering a submarine ambush. A wave of at least 6 Venoms sank the USS Biddle and badly damaged the engines of the newly recommissioned Blakely, but no other major ships were damaged or threatened. As destroyers began hunting the Venoms, the Morgana fleet waiting under the cover of rain saw their chance and steamed out to engage the American fleet. A chaotic battle developed with the Venoms periodically returning to launch more torpedo attacks amid the surface battle. At first, only the generally poor Morgana gunnery saved the fleet, but the heavier guns and armor of the Atlantic battleships soon proved decisive. USS Herbert was lost in the battle as she valiantly challenged an enemy cruiser, however. The fleet chased the routing Morgana into the storm system and discovered the source of the weather disturbances, a strange device anchored seemingly in the depths of the Puerto Rican Trench. It was cut free and taken aboard USS Moffett, with the Morgana device ultimately being transported to an improvised secure facility at Havana Harbor. However, 109 American sailors reportedly lost their lives in its capture. Following the recovery of the device, the storms near Puerto Rico dissipated by the 30th. And the Morgana Venom was rather angry about it, reports say. Meanwhile, following the Second War Plan, the bulk of the Pacific Fleet sailed at speed for the relief of Manila. The Morgana had first laid siege to Manila Bay since just before midnight local time on October 12th. It was October 30th when the metaphorical cavalry finally arrived. The battle was preceded by a combined airstrike from the Army and Navy on the gathered Morgana before the battle fleet arrived to challenge them. The Americans, steaming out of the Verde Island Passage, tried at first to force the Morgana between Corregidor and their line, but the enemy started steaming west almost immediately as they caught sight of the Americans. Caught off guard, USS California felt the brunt of their gunnery as the Morgana successfully crossed her T. In an attempt to escape the barrage, the Americans then turned eastward to open their line and bring the enemy under the guns at Corregidor. The Morgana might have declined battle at this point were it not for the excellent gunnery of USS Oklahoma, who crippled the lead treason. As the Morgana line turned to avoid her, the lead Vanity chose to lead the Morgana back into the waiting arms of the Americans. The outcome was nearly as complete as it was 40 years ago. General MacArthur, newly reactivated, then received the fleet at Manila, following the Battle of the Philippines, also subsequently marking its end. After that, we head across the Pacific to the Empire of Japan, who is the fourth contributing nation to our united front. This week saw the first formal meeting between the Emperor and the risen Kami, which was a most auspicious occasion. There was an absence, however, and a conspicuous one at that. IJN Nagato, who had not been able to attend. But even here there was cause for contentment. She had left for Formosa with a large escort following the enactment of War Plan, the Nagato Escort, to lead the Kami there against the Funayuri that gathered like a storm east of Taihoku. That could not change the fact that it was a day that changed all of Japan, and a day that made the prospect of surprise Chinese offensive seem distant and unimportant. And yet at the same time the Morgana fire drifted in a myriad into Japanese waters. The enemy could be kept at bay for a day, but they were hungry still. Captains Poi and Two Heavens of the Imperial Japanese Navy provided this somewhat edited eyewitness account of the ceremony to the Naval War College. Quote, "Such a momentous event required a great deal of logistics to begin. Firstly, it required military logistics of a scale normally only seen during large-scale exercises or preparing for major offensives. It also required some very masterful ship handling, quietly aided by the kami who had been chosen to represent the kami of the fleet. Each ship had to be as close to each other and to the site of the meeting as was physically possible to allow each kami to be fully present. Then ramps were carefully constructed to allow the delivery of specially made mikoshi up to the decks of the ships. If the kami were to be taken from their holes, they must be taken the proper way. The spiritual logistics were another massive endeavor in their own right. Setting aside the mikoshi, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal itself had been prepared carefully by members of the Imperial Household Agency and by Shinto priests. The Navy Yard almost looked like a shrine in its own right. Grand torii had been erected at the entrances, and all manner of charms and blessings prepared. Everything had to be perfect. The day began with offerings to the god of the sea, the god of fire, the god of war, and a panoply of others, all performed by the most senior priests in Japan. The air was heavy with the scent of burned incense and miko, walked from ship to ship. The young women were bringing offerings, conducting purifying rituals, all while singing songs of praise as they went. Barrels of sacred sake, donated from various shrines across Japan, were piled by the bow of each ship next to the altars where the miko and priests left their offerings to the kami of the fleets themselves. But what almost resembled a matsuri, a shrine festival, the mood was quite intense instead of cheerful and festive. This was a matter of utmost importance. The Emperor was meeting his fellow divines formally for the first time. There was a sense of deep anticipation as the procession that would bring the Emperor to the designated place of meeting along the docks approached. As the Imperial party arrived at the docks, 2 mikoshi arose as one on the decks of 2 warships, carried by their crews, and preceded by an honor guard of officers. Still, even when one would think all eyes would be on the Son of Heaven and the kami, security was tight. Even as the kami departed their bodies of steel and steam, every lookout post was manned. Aircraft guarded the skies and destroyers prowled far out to sea, hunting for any trace of the great enemy. Nothing would interrupt this holy meeting. Nothing. The 2 mikoshi came to rest before the maze of silk screens prepared for the meeting, gently being lowered to the ground as the portions of their crew selected to represent their fellows form up behind their officers. Quickly they bowed deeply in unison as the tenno arrives. No longer clad in the military uniforms the Emperor had been seen in recently, he was once again clad in the golden raiment of full sokotai, the formal court dress of the imperial household, looking every bit the divine god-king that ruled over the land of the rising sun and all that the sun's rays touched. Once the tenno had taken his place atop his throne, they straightened back up. They all knew what would come next. They all knew their own kami after all, but still, a part of them strained to see what would happen next. The first kami to alight from her mikoshi was an unorthodox choice. To many in Naval High Command, she wasn't a battleship or a carrier, but instead a mere support vessel. But none could deny her kami's patriotic fervor. There was no more ardent adherent to the will of the tenno than Chiyoda. Far from her usual dress, she emerged from her mikoshi in full Juna Hitoe, carrying a lacquered case that contained a gift to her Imperial Majesty. It would later be reported by the Imperial Household Agency that the gift was a pair of custom-made golf clubs handcrafted by the kami herself. The next kami, however, was also someone unexpected. A destroyer from her hull, the young woman was fresh-faced and cheery. Her beaming smile added some color back to the proceedings and relieving some of the growing tensions. But Kasumi, too, was a warrior, and those who were close enough could see the sword callus on her hands from rigorous training with the weapon at her hip, even as she radiated her joy to the world around her. As one, the 2 stepped forward on the carpeted path that had been prepared for them. The position of the wooden platform they would greet the Emperor from had been carefully measured before it had been placed. They slipped behind the silk screens to meet with the Son of Heaven at the absolute furthest they could possibly walk from their hulls. A hush falls over the assembled people as the Emperor rises from his throne and follows his own path behind the screens. The meeting of the divines was a sacred one, and not for the eyes or ears of mere mortals. The onlookers instead listen to the traditional music and chanting as the ceremony around them goes on. This place itself was sacred now, not just from the meeting that was occurring, but it was a navy yard. The ships that lived here had always been special, but now their ships walked alongside mortals. Propriety required certain ships be taken for their sake, and the sake of their crews, even the foreigners, or perhaps especially the foreigners. Someone had to teach them how to respect the gods they now served properly, after all. Time passes with no sign of life among the screens. It was easy to speculate what was being discussed by the gods. But still the crews kept their silence, as did the Imperial household staff, and the combined pressure from those two groups silenced the rest. All there was to do was wait, and enjoy the Miko's songs. An hour passes before the Emperor returns to his throne, and the kami emerge from behind the screens once again. Each woman carries with them an ornate imperial seal, the lacquered wood and the glinting gold shining brightly in the sunlight. The bond between Emperor and the vassal in physical form, imperial power made manifest. Each kami would receive their own special seal in the coming weeks. Each kami would pledge her fealty to the Byzantium throne personally. These kami, though, were the first, and they slowly returned to the Mikoshi with their heads held high. Once the ornate wooden doors of the palanquin of the kami were closed by the sailors attending them, a jester from the Tenno summons one of the priests, who bows deeply as the Emperor draws a scroll from within his robes and hands it to the man. The priest keeps his head firmly down to the Emperor, taking a few steps backwards before turning and straightening up, unfurling the scroll with a flourish before beginning to read the words the Emperor had written for this occasion. From any other ruler, any other leader, it would have been a grand and inspiring speech. From Emperor Hirohito, however, it was instead a poem. His Imperial Majesty's talented poetry was well known among the court, and the simple verses spoke of a desire for clear skies, for free seas, and for every heart to hold courage in the face of the demons that now stalk the earth. It was a most moving poem, with some eyes watering, even with some of the sailors having to translate into numerous other languages for their shipmates. It was not inspiring in the same way that a man screaming with passion might whip up a crowd, but in that moment all shared the Emperor's dream for peace to return to the world, and all that shared the resolution to see through what had to be done to win that peace. The order, the mandate of heaven itself was clear, so far as the common sailor understood it. The security of the home islands and Japan's most critical lanes of trade had been secured. The kami, the gods themselves, had re-established their bond with the imperial household, and was as it should be. All was ready. Now, with the Emperor's will in their hearts, every captain, kami, officer, and sailor of the Imperial Japanese Navy knew that their time had come. The Imperial Japanese Navy had defended, as was their duty. Now the Emperor bid them to be Japan's avenging sword, and to cleanse the demons from the seas of this earth. This, too, was their duty. They had been reacting to the demons. Now they would make the demons react to them. As the Emperor alights into his palanquin to return to the palace, the kami return to their Mikoshi. One bell captain steps forward and raises their sheathed sword over their head, gaining the attention of every man, woman, and child in the naval yard. The world holds its breath for a moment as the captain centers themselves for a second and shouts so loudly the gods in heaven could hear. "Tenno Heika!" The assembled men and women of the Imperial Japanese Navy answer in one voice. "Banzai!" The crews bow as one and rush back to their ships, casting off lines and immediately starting to make their way out of the port, to the cheers and exultation of their fellows and civilians present. The Imperial Japanese Navy would commence offensive operations immediately. I'd like to say thank you to the Naval War College for allowing us to use their eyewitness account, and what a rousing day that must have been for the people of Japan. Hopefully they can utilize this newly found fervor to fight against the Morgana more profoundly than they already have. Following that, we head back over to Europe to hear news from France, the fifth contributing member to our united front. This week, Deladier and Georges Mandel gathered their experts and weighed their options in Indochina, and sources stated that none of them seemed particularly promising. The Ministry des Colonies and his faction argued that Hanoi had no hope or self-sufficiency with the Morgana feasting upon commerce in the Gulf of Siam and the South China Sea. They also argued passionately that France could not afford to divert military supplies from the metropole as Germany was embarking on a campaign of conquest. Indeed, they had some sympathy with those who called for the return of Georges Quatreau, whose talents were wasted in an unwinnable theater. Deladier's government decided then that turning to the British was the best possible option with the proposed war plan Indochina Design Alliance. Through this proposal, the British would be offered bases in Indochina and a commercial treaty for Indo-Chinese resources. In exchange, the Royal Navy would be asked to provide a degree of naval security that the Marine Nationale could not guarantee alone. On the eve of these negotiations, a certain calm settled in Paris. Interdepartmental turmoil, at least over this particular question, cooled and settled. The decision was made, the die was cast, and all that remained was to be seen what their friends across the Manche would ask in return. Of course, early rumors of the French position made their way to Indochina, and their response was not so serene. Opponents of colonial rule saw an opportunity, and the French themselves, well, they hardly knew if they were staying or going. Following that, we turn our attention to the north to hear news from Germany, who is the sixth contributing nation in our war against the Morgana. This week, the Kriegsmarine faced two political tests, neither one of which was resolved to the satisfaction of their masters in Berlin. The first and more public crisis came in the form of the KMS Admiral Scheer and her acting Capitan, Erich Ferneck. The Scheer had been badly damaged weeks before, and her bell had somehow relocated her to the other side of the Atlantic in an instant. As the crew gathered themselves at the edge of American waters, they found an American vessel, the SS Pancraft, under attack from the Morgana fleet, which had apparently been transporting war supplies intended for British use. The Scheer sunk the Pancraft, rescued her crew, to supplement Scheer's own, and made their way back to the North Sea, where the British promptly accused them of piracy. Erich Ferneck surrendered himself not to the British, but instead to the League of Nations, as represented by the captain of the Battle of Skagerrak Strait, where an independent investigation of his behavior would be conducted. Absolutely nobody was happy with this, but since the Kriegsmarine retained KMS Admiral Scheer, it was deemed a vaguely tolerable humiliation, at least compared to the other case. In the Baltic, certain Kriegsmarine vessels had come upon the badly damaged Polish submarine ORP Orzel. She had left ex-Polish waters for safe harbor in Estonia in the early days of the war, and there the crew had been declared interned, and the Estonians had attempted to secure the submarine for the duration. ORP Orzel's crew had staged a daring escape and had taken the sub on a mad dash toward the safety of Scotland. But between Morgana and the Kriegsmarine they hadn't gotten very far. Now, though, ORP Orzel's bell was awake, and it was a real test of leadership to know what precisely should be done. Ultimately, the officer in question chose to abide by the informal consensus taken in the early days of the Morgana War. That is, a woken bell was to be considered under the flag of the League of Nations, and that all due courtesy was to be given. As such, the Kriegsmarine sailors helped patch the damage to her hull as best they could, and made her swear not to attack any German vessels on her way out to the North Sea. And then they let her go. Unfortunately, sources report that a number of promising careers ended shortly thereafter. Ominously more so, tighter controls in the Kriegsmarine were in the offing at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. I reached out to an old family friend of mine inside Germany's military, who wished to remain anonymous, but said this in regards to the situation. Quote, "It has been seen that members of the Kriegsmarine, including those outside of the Oberkommando der Marine, have exercised too much autonomy outside of military command structures. While I think what they did was admirable, many see that order must be restored among the ranks so that orders, both militarily and politically, are actually followed." End quote. This likely means that the Kriegsmarine will see less choices in the future as the leashes tighten around them. Hopefully, that leash won't turn into a noose anytime soon. Lastly, we head over to the east to hear news from our comrades in the Soviet Union, who are the seventh contributing nation to our united front. The Soviets made two important decisions this week. The first was through the war plan studied the pools of the disease, which found 95% support from the Politburo, and involved the survivors of Disease's Romanian campaign, the last surviving inhabitants of a small settlement between the Komarova Forest and the Black Sea in southeastern Romania. Sources say the survivors were bundled up, coughing and shivering, and led into a convoy of unmarked, heavily guarded trucks before taken north. Soviet and Romanian troops ferreted out the last of Disease's creations and destroyed them. The Detrius was also driven north as a result. I attempted to reach out to one of my friends in the NKVD to gather more information on what Disease's creations were, but the only thing he said was, quote, "I dare not speak about what I saw or what we did in the quarantine zones, only that we did what we had to," end quote. Days later, I received the news that my southern contact had suffered an unfortunate, workplace accident while treating himself for ailments. I presume the treatment was 762 by 25. The second decision the Soviets had this week was a response to a communique from Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. He had hoped that forging a stronger friendship between his nation and the Soviet Union might give the Italians pause. However, Stalin's government declined, recalling the long association with the White Russians in Yugoslavia, which had previously pulled them into the Great War. Stalin sent a letter to Mussolini and made him aware that they had declined as well. Meanwhile, in the Baltic, the Morgana starvation appeared outside of the Kronstadt forts, guarding the approach to Leningrad. This one seemed different than the others, almost so translucent as to be invisible. She drew fire, of course, but she seemed unconcerned, or rather, she seemed too angry to care. She accused the Soviets of making a deal with the Morgana avarice, whom sources say she then insulted with great passion and creative language, I might add, and she promised that the citizens of Leningrad would suffer if they didn't find a way to make it up to her. It must be a strange time for the Soviets to be involved in a triangle between different Morgana, but perhaps they should take her words seriously, just in case she actually intends to back them up. And with that concludes our extended League of Nations War Report for week 1 of November. This week had a lot of action, with each nation trying their best to tackle threats as they appear, and the League of Nations would like to thank all of you for working hard to keep our world safe and to solve the global crisis we find ourselves in. And as a reminder to all captains and citizens alike that this League of Nations broadcast is intended on keeping you informed about the unified war effort against the Morgana. But there is only something you can do. Consider purchasing some war bonds to help our boys and girls on the ocean stay afloat and fight off the Morgana wherever they may be. Doing so will also net you prestige among your peers that you can utilize in a variety of ways. Though if you're a captain looking for more, consider purchasing a League of Nations Commissioner membership card. Becoming a commissioner grants you access to our exclusive network of traders and salvage crews to gain more resources, along with the ability to meet with our expert naval training staff and diplomatic envoys to earn more experience for almost any occasion. You also gain the knowledge of our professional R&D and production centers to build equipment quickly and squish those gremlins even faster. And don't forget to take advantage of our experienced harbor staff for faster refit and repair times. To top it all off, you'll be letting the bells know who and what you truly support, gaining the adoration that much quicker. Thank you for listening, and may you have smooth seas.